So far we created the processes to fill our Solar index to allow us to search for Twitter tweets. We are now going to create a new web application that allows us to access them in a very easy way. So what I did is I logged into the RapidMiner server, and I will now create a new web application. Therefore, I can click here on New Web Application. First of all, of course, I want to give it a title. So let's call it Brand Monitoring Demo. We can define how big this app should be in the screen resolution, so let's keep it to the defaults. And we can also supply it with a tooltip that will show up here in the list of the apps. We can also give a bigger description to tell the user what he can actually expect. First of all, let's save that web application, the definition of this web application, in the repository by clicking here. So I will store it under report. So each web application in RapidMiner Server consists of so-called components. And we have components for visualization. We can add arbitrary static text that will allow us to, just enter a description to tell the user what he sees. We can use images for layouting, for example, including our logo or something like that. We can add a user input where the user can define something. And we also have some buttons, and we can also integrate external web resources. So each web application is made up of a combination of these components. We have different views on this web application, so now we are in the general settings, but we can also switch to the layout. So currently the pane of this web application is completely blank, but I can now add a new component. So we are going to add a query so that you have an input field to allow the user to enter some query term. So this is a user input. So let's add a new user input. And you see when I add a component, it shows up here in the pane, and I can arrange that somehow. So this user input, we can add it here by click on this button. So every component can be arranged here in the layouting view. I can also resize that. But if I want to edit the component itself, I can click here, and we switch to the definition of that component. So first of all, I give it a title that says query term, and I don't want to show any frames, so I uncheck that so that we just have a plain input field. If I want to give the user now some control, I need to select variables that he can influence. In this case, I want to have a variable that takes the query term that I enter. Problem is I didn't define any variables yet. So let's leave the definition of the component first and add a new variable. You see that we can click here on a new variable. However, before we can add a variable, we need to define which realm we want to use. If we go back to the general settings, you see that we don't have defined a realm yet. So what is a realm? A realm is a collection of data types, and we can define them in RapidMiner Server ourselves. So let's go here on Manage Domains, where we can now create a new realm. And I will call my realm Brand Monitoring Realm. And here we can now add domains to that realm, so basically the value types. What I need is a text domain because I want to add a query. So I will just call this domain text domain. And the preset value is simply empty. I also want to have a date domain because in the end I want to also add some date selectors. So let's use a date domain. We simply leave that to the default format, and the earliest possible, we can select now the earliest possible value, because, well, we don't have any Twitter tweets from before December because we just started the collection. So I can also select that I just want to start December the 1st, and the latest possible value is always today, because we can't have well, Twitter tweets from the future, right? So okay, the default value is just today. Okay, I will save that domain now and switch back to our web application. And here I now want to change the realm and use the brand monitoring realm I just defined. So now we have a realm, and from this collection of different data types we now can create new variables. So I go back to the variables view here, so we see it's completely empty right now, but I can click on new variable here to add one. So let's start with a text domain, and I will just call this variable query. And for the display I want to call that uppercase query. I can also add a description, enter your search here, something like that. So now we have a variable. If I go back to the layout, I can now use the query, use this component and add the variable we just defined to the variables that I can control over this component. Okay, and submit. So currently this is a pretty boring application, but let's click on preview to see how it looks like. So you see we just can enter a query and submit it. So far nothing will happen because there's no component that shows data. So let's add a new component, a visualization component for some data set. So we'll just drag it here. Okay, so this is perhaps a good position for that, for the results. So let's edit this single component. The visualization component has different settings, of course. First of all, I want to call that results. And because it might be helpful for the user to see what the results are actually for, I also want to include the current value of the query variable. And I can use the same notation I use in RapidMiner for macros. I can use here for including the report variables into the title. Okay, let's go to the format of that component, where we can also define where the data actually comes from. And now the idea is that we can subscribe to an object, and I will call that object query results. These objects will be delivered by RapidMiner processes. We will see that in a few minutes. And whenever a RapidMiner process changes the query results object, this component will be updated and we will see the new results. Okay, so that's the data source. Now we also have to define how the data should be rendered. I want to use a simple table to show us the results. Okay, so let's submit that and let's save that. So what we now need is a process that actually delivers this table. In the very beginning, when we just start the web application, there won't be any results because we didn't enter a query term yet. But what we need to do is we need to deliver some empty object or some default, right? Otherwise, the component will just show there's no data to be shown. So let's click here on General Settings, and you see that there is an initialization process. So what I can do is I can define one process that will be executed before the web application is started, and that we can use to populate our components with the default values. So let's create an initialization process. Therefore, I will switch to RapidMiner Studio that we use again as a development environment for these processes. Okay, I'm now in the design perspective of RapidMiner Studio, where we will now create the initialization process. That's pretty easy. So far we just want to have a table with the results, right? And we can think about how the result should look like. So it will be a table that has 3 columns, probably some sort of like search term, perhaps on Twitter, an author, and the text, right? So if we want to create an empty example set with a specific header, the easiest way is to use the data editor. So what I will do now is I use the data editor that you can enable over the view, show view data editor to create an empty data set that we can push to the dashboard during the initialization. So I click on new and I will add rows, and the row is something like author and query term and text. So usually I would now add new rows to the table, but I actually want to have an empty table. So I press on Save As and select my repository. So marketing, demo, brand monitoring. Let's create a folder here called data. And select that. Empty results table. Okay. So the dataset is now stored in the repository, and my process for the initialization is very simple. In order to create the initialization process, first of all, I will store the process on the right location in the repository. Store process here and say and OK. And then I simply drag in my empty dataset that I just created. And use the publish to app to now publish this dataset into the report state that I called query results. Need to take care, it's case sensitive. Okay, I will store this process, I will save this process again. Let's go back to our RapidMiner server. Okay, here in the server we are now switching back to the general settings and select the process for the initialization. And we can immediately run this process that will populate the dashboard objects, so that if we go here back to layouting and editing that single component, we will already get the initial state here, and we see this will be the table. Well, actually I don't think it is so important to have the author and query term as large in the table as the text, so go back to format and say, okay, I want to have the column with 1, 1 and 4, so this is a relative number, so text will be 4 times as wide as query term and author. That looks much better. Okay, so still this complete web app is not very useful, right? So we just initialized it and we have an empty table. So what we really need to do is now we need to have a process that takes in the query variable, does a query, and publishes these results to the query results. Okay, so let's create a process for that, and I will switch back to RapidMiner Studio. Back in RapidMiner Studio, I will create a new process and store that in the repository, calling it probably query is a good idea. Okay, in this process I somehow need to get what the user entered as query. And what the user enters as query is stored in the reporting variable query. And it's very simple to get this value, because if we go to the process context, we can define a macro that is called query, and the value of the reporting variable will automatically be injected into this macro. And the default should be something like whatever we want to enter, right? This is mainly for demonstration or for testing this process, and I will simply enter RapidMiner here. In order to perform a query on the Solar index, we now need to add the respective operator. So I will add search Solar, and the version that will give me the data in a data table of an example set. And first of all, once we added the search Solar operator, we need to select on which connection it should work. So this is the connection I get from the server, and the collection is mentioned. Okay. And now is the question which query to enter. So in the context we have defined the word that the user enters, and here in the query we need to enter the Solar search syntax. In this case it looks like that, so we tell Solar in which field we want to search, in this case in the text field, and what we want to search. In this case, whatever the user entered in query. So this will be replaced by the actual query by RapidMiner. Okay, if I now run that, I will run the query with the default, which is RapidMiner. So let's take a look what happens. So we get 100 rows of tweets. Okay, fine. We also notice that we have more columns than we actually want to show in the web application. So there are two steps now involved. So first we want to select the attributes and get rid of all the columns that we don't want to have. From user is actually what I want to see as author. We have the query term, which is also there, and the text itself. Okay, but you also see that this is not called as we want to have that in our web application. We want to have author, query term, and text. So we need to rename the from user into author. Okay, and now if we execute that again, the result pretty much looks like we want to have it. And we see, okay, we just have 100 rows. Do we have by chance just 100 tweets? No, the reason for that is that we limited the search here using the limit parameter to 100. So meaning if I want to have more or less hits shown, I can increase or decrease the numbers. So if I just enter 10, I just get 10 results. Of course I can add also a very high number giving me all the results. Problem is then it can take some time to of course publish that to a web page, right? If you have 1 million tweets and showing them on one page, this is probably not a good idea. We can also sort the results by selecting a field, and I think it's a good idea to use the to show the most recent version of of the tweets using created at in a descending way. So now we should have the most recent hits on the top. If we want to control that, it's pretty hard now because we don't have the date in the result anymore. But luckily we can just right click on the ports here and show the intermediate results by clicking here and see that it's now correctly sorted. So the most recent are on top. Actually, the tweets from today. Okay. So what's still missing is we need to publish that. Again, we use the publish to app operator and call it again query results. Okay, so whenever this process is now executed, the search, the current value of query will be searched on Solr, and we get the results to the object. So the only thing that is missing now is we need to incorporate this logic somehow in the report, and therefore we switch back to the report designer. Okay, so here in the report designer we now need to think about when do we actually want to execute that process. So the best idea is whenever I change the query term, right? Because then I want to update the query results. So I go here in the definition of that component, and on all components you can add so-called effects. And one of the effects can be to run the process. So now I select my query process, and submit that. And now whenever I change the query and press on the submit button, this process will be executed, executing the query and updating the results. So let's see if that really works. I now go to preview. Okay, so let's enter RapidMiner and submit that. Now the process should be executed and populating the dashboard, and see it automatically did that, and pretty amazingly fast, right? And we see again the same results here in the web application. So it's pretty easy to build your own web application by just implementing a few processes.